I want to read just a couple of sentences from the description because I put some thought into it. I'm not going to read the whole thing, but just this one part. He's trying to explain why we act rather than telling us how we should act, although he does some of that too. So a large part of what I'm going to talk about is the why we act part, but at times I'm going to get into how we should act. And you'll see that he gives some advice that in pretty much every case I think is good advice. Now I want to give you a little background. I gave a talk here last spring and I was talking to Joan Wiener, who, by the way, has a master's in economics from the University of Maryland. And she said, wait a minute, this is the 300th anniversary of Adam Smith's birth. And, you know, maybe we should have a talk on this. So I actually met with her for coffee, and we talked out various ideas. And so any mistakes in this are on her. No, actually, there's a reasonable probability there are going to be mistakes in my first lecture, and here's why. It's all on the theory of moral sentiments, and I'd never read the theory of moral sentiments. It's a dense book. And so what I did was I took to my cottage in Canada this summer and read 20 pages of it, because I had a great time at my cottage. I took it on a cross-country flight, went from here to Phoenix to Boston in October, and then back in early November. And I had about 8 hours uninterrupted and pretty much finished it. And there were a lot of surprises, a lot of nuggets, and I'm hoping I'm going to get to almost all the good nuggets here. Who here has seen me speak here? Who here hasn't? Okay, well then this is worth doing really quickly. I always give a little background about myself. That's not me. That's Adam Smith. Here's how to reach me. David R. Henderson, 1950 @gmail.com. Remember the middle initial R, or else it doesn't get to me. You might have a sense of what year I was born in. And a little about my background. So from 82 to 84, I was the senior economist for health policy with Reagan's Council of Economic Advisors. 83, 84, I took on the energy portfolio. And here's me with the guy, that's me on the right. But, and then, this is what I'm most likely to be remembered for. The first, and really still the only, reader-friendly encyclopedia of economics. You can buy it online, relatively cheap for what you're getting, but you can get every entry in it for free online if you go to econlib.org and check for encyclopedia, concise encyclopedia. So that's that. And one last thing I'm very proud of. The man I'm about to show you mentored me, although he never taught me in front of a class, but I read a lot of his work and I knocked on his door when I was 19 years old. And that's the guy, the short guy who's actually shorter than me with glasses. Someone who hasn't seen me speak before. Who is that?
Milton.
You got it, Milton Fried. Okay, so that's a little background. Now a background on Adam Smith. Born in June 1723, we're not sure the exact date. Raised by a widowed mom. And again, I was focusing on theory of moral sentiments, so I didn't have time to check this story. So I'm going to say this story, I'm 90% sure it's true, that he was kidnapped by gypsies when he was about 4, but they got him back. I think that's true. You can probably check. We think of him as an economist, and that'll be the lecture next Wednesday when I talk about Wealth of Nations, which I know quite well. But he was chair of moral philosophy. His actual teaching position was for 12 years chair of moral philosophy at Glasgow University. And then he got a chance to be tutor to a young man who was Duke of Buccleuch. So he went touring Europe with this Duke. And so he tutored him, but he got to meet all kinds of people. He had conversations with Voltaire, with Rousseau, all these pretty heavy hitters. And they thought quite well of him too. His closest friend was David Hume, the philosopher, who was older than him. and died the year The Wealth of Nations came out, 1776, when we were busy with other things on this continent. So that's a little background on Smith. Now, one thing that immediately comes up for people who've read big parts of the theory of moral sentiments and big parts of The Wealth of Nations is what is called, it's actually got a term in economics and philosophy, it's called the Adam Smith problem. And here's what is regarded as the problem: the theory of moral sentiments versus the wealth of nations. As we'll see, the theory of moral sentiments is telling us that we really ought to care about our fellow man and woman. The wealth of nations is saying that basically the economy runs on self-interest. And some people see a contradiction in that. People who I think study it carefully see no contradiction. It's just talking about two different things. Theory of moral sentiments, he's talking about how people behave and what seems to make for a good life. Not necessarily a wealthy life, a good life. Wealth of nations, he's talking about how does an economy work? What drives people to serve others? And those are separate issues. There is some overlap, and I'm going to get into some overlap today and probably some overlap next week. Okay, now here's how Smith begins the book. How selfish soever, he means whatsoever, man may be supposed, there are evidently some principles in his nature which interest him in the fortune of others and render their happiness necessary to him, though he derives nothing from it except the pleasure of seeing it. So one of the issues is, again, because people who haven't read The Wealth of Nations carefully will sometimes say it's all about why we should be selfish. He never says that. He just says why self-interest ends up working for the greater good, because you do well by serving your fellow man. But so then the question is he advocating selfishness? And the answer is no. And I realized in putting this together over the last few days, I could have voluminous things that you're going to read and I'm going to talk, and then what are you supposed to focus on? So what I did was on some of these longer quotes, I'm just going to read them. So on page 25, he says, he distinguishes between virtue and mere propriety. Upon many occasions, to act with the most perfect propriety requires no more than that common and ordinary degree of sensibility or self-command, which the most worthless of mankind are possessed of, and sometimes even that degree is not necessary. Thus, to give a very low instance, to eat when we are hungry is certainly upon ordinary occasions perfectly right and proper, and cannot miss being approved of as such by everybody. Nothing, however, could be more absurd than to say it was virtuous. In other words, just because you go and take care of yourself doesn't mean you're virtuous. Whereas, a little confession here, when I was in college, a friend of mine who noticed how bored I was gave me a copy of Ayn Rand's The Fountainhead. And it changed my life. And I think I've abstracted all the good stuff. But for the next few months, I was really obnoxious. My mother wanted me to go to the store. Wait a minute, that's not in my self-interest. That's altruistic. That's self-sacrifice. And my mother did not slap me. She wasn't that kind of person, but she said, go to the store. Okay? So the point is, he's not Ayn Rand. Just in case that needs to be said. Now, in reading some of his stuff, I had this thought. By the way, some of these thoughts are original with me in the sense of how I connect them with today. Some of what I'm going to say comes from this book that I reviewed a few years ago when it came out by an economist named Russ Roberts. Who here has heard of Russ Roberts? If you like podcasts, he does something called Econ Talk. And as he said in an interview, I was watching an interview with him this morning for other reasons. And as he said in the interview, maybe 30% of it is now about economics, 70% is just about interesting ideas. But he wrote this book called How Adam Smith Can Change Your Life. And basically, he's going through the theory of moral sentiments and talking about some of the things he learned from it. And I actually think, I wish I reread this book a month ago, I actually think he has a better organization of this than my talk has, but oh well. Yes. So here's one that I will take credit for, as never having seen elsewhere. The connection between Adam Smith and Michael Jackson. Smith said, the big thing going on is the tribunal of our own consciences. In other words, the big tribunal, the big judge we have to pay attention to is us. We're the ultimate judge. Now, Russ has a great line in one of his chapters. He talks about the iron law of me. And the iron law of me says, I'm mainly concerned about myself. And Adam Smith is saying, yeah, but you should extend that a little and be somewhat concerned about others. And the easiest thing to do is to trick yourself into thinking you're really doing it for others when you're actually doing it for yourself. He has a story in here about Joan Baez and her sister Mimi. And her sister Mimi had a boyfriend, and it was around here, around Big Sur or Carmel or something. And Joan, I think, was already over in Europe to do a performance, and it was early in her career. And Mimi's husband got in a motorcycle and got killed. And the question was, should Joan Baez come back for the funeral to be with her sister, to comfort her sister? And Joan Baez said, I think the guy's name was Richard. And Joan said, no, I think Richard would have wanted me to perform in Europe. And so it's very easy to kid yourself that what you want is what someone would have wanted. And it turned out later that's absolutely not what Mimi wanted. Okay. But back to this. He talks about the man within the breast. He talks about that a lot. That's the person in us. And another term he uses a lot is the impartial spectator. We should try to be impartial about ourselves. So, am I doing this for me, and that may be fine, or am I doing it for others? So a standard one, and I really pretty much have gotten this out of my vocabulary, but sometimes it does piss people off. When someone will invite me to something and I'll say I can't, people say I can't go, of course I can go, typically. A better way, I think, is to say no thank you. I have other plans, which is the real thing going on, not I can't go. There's just that one little thing. Or another one Russ points out in his book, you'll be on the phone with someone and you want to get off the line and you'll say, well, I'm sure you need to go. And I've got that completely out of my vocabulary. I'll say, no, I need to go. And when someone calls me up and says, do you have a minute? I will always say, I've got literally 2 minutes. Okay. And Michael Jackson, I'm starting, should I sing it? No, you don't want to sing it. I'm starting with the man in the mirror. I'm asking him to change his ways. So his impartial spectator, his judge, is the person he's looking at in the mirror, himself. I listen to KION a lot, and they have that song on 3 or 4 times a day. Or 3 or 4 times while I'm listening to it, so it must be like 15 times a day. And I was thinking, driving along a month ago, thinking, that's Adam Smith. So, as I said, there sometimes is an overlap with Wealth of Nations, and here's one of them that I found striking and surprising. And I will get into some of the economics once I read this. For to what purpose is all the toil and bustle of this world? What is the end of avarice and ambition, of the pursuit of wealth, of power and preeminence? Is it to supply the necessities of nature? And here's where he surprised me a little. The wages of the meanest, meaning the poorest laborer, can supply them. We see that they afford him food and clothing, the comfort of a house and of a family. If we examine his economy with rigor, we should find that he spends a great part of them upon conveniences which may be regarded as superfluities. In other words, he's saying even then, when he's writing in 1758, the poorest laborer in Britain has enough to live on plus. That was shocking to me. I didn't think that was true, but then I started thinking about how that was part of the motivation for The Wealth of Nations, which he wrote over a bunch of years, so he started writing not long after this book was finished, was what Adam Smith was observing in Britain compared to, say, France, where he had just visited, was that with a relatively free economy, the vast majority of people were becoming better off. And it was just noticeable in his lifetime. I just found that really striking. Another issue he talks about is celebrity. And here's what he says. The man of rank and distinction, on the contrary, is observed by all the world. Everybody is eager to look at him and to conceive, at least by sympathy, that joy and exaltation with which his circumstances naturally inspire him. His actions are the objects of the public care. Scarce a word, scarce a gesture can fall from him that is altogether neglected. And when I read that, you know who I thought of? I don't know if you watch football much. Taylor Swift and Travis Kelce. Every little thing, right? And again, this is an observation of people, but Russ Roberts dug deeper, and I've found other parts that affirm this, that he's saying, well, maybe we shouldn't be that way. You know, maybe we should pay attention to ourselves and more normal people and not just the celebrities. And really, what's the big deal? I was telling a friend of mine this morning about this talk I'm giving. He's one of my longest time friends. We met in graduate school. A friend named Tom Nagel. And I reminded him of how he helped me with that way back in the 70s. I graduated, I hadn't graduated. I went to University of Rochester without my dissertation done. So I was tired of thinking of McDonald's as being luxury food. And so I finished my dissertation at the University of Rochester, and I'd go back every summer and visit him and others who were still at UCLA. I mentioned Ayn Rand. She had a sidekick who they had a nasty, nasty split in the late 60s, named Nathaniel Branden. And he was a psychologist. And I'd become kind of friendly with Branden, and to me he was like a celebrity. And so I was back visiting Tom in LA, that's where Branden was, that's where Branden lived. And I had a chance to go to some small numbers event with Branden. And I was told Tom I was gonna go. And Tom says, wait a minute, weren't we gonna do something together? And I don't think I said it this crassly, but I communicated the idea that Branden was important. And he goes, aren't I important? And I go, oh yeah, you're right. And that changed me like that. It changed me on the whole issue of celebrity. I told him that, but I have this amazing memory for these things. Tom has zero memory. He said, that's great. He had no memory of that at all. That was a big step. And now we get to monarchs versus average people. This is a long quote, but I did use it because it's 2 pages here. The traitor who conspires against the life of the monarch is thought a greater monster than any other murderer. All the innocent blood that was shed in the civil wars prevent less indignation than the death of Charles I, one person. And then he says, the kings are the servants of the people to be obeyed. He's saying the kings should be the servants, to be obeyed, resisted, deposed, or punished as the public conveniency may require, is the doctrine of reason and philosophy. In other words, when you use reason, you come to that conclusion. But it is not the doctrine of nature. There's something in our nature that makes us care way more about those people. So take 2 extreme cases. Stalin, when he died, was mourned not just in the Soviet Union. That famous singer, Paul Robeson, wrote a piece, I think, in the New York Times. It was like a tribute to Stalin. Castro, I came from Canada, where Pierre Trudeau was friends with Fidel Castro, and his son Justin became kind of friendly with him. And Justin, unlike all the other Western leaders, would just paid real tribute to him when he died. So that was interesting. Now, again, if you we'll see next week when we talk about the wealth of nations that, well, I might as well use the quote. I'll do it next week too, but it's just good to have said it here. It is not from the benevolence of the butcher, the brewer, the baker that we have our dinner, but from their regard to their own self-interest. In other words, the way we're going to get bread from the baker, meat from the butcher, or beer from the brewer is not by saying, please be nice to me. It's by saying, I will pay you. And then they have an incentive to produce, and we pay, and we have an incentive to get it because we value those things more than we value the money. So that would say those basic motives really drive an economy. And you might think, therefore, that Adam Smith says motives don't matter. Well, he doesn't say that. So here's what he says, and again, it differs from the wealth of nations, but doesn't contradict the wealth of nations. He says, we do not, therefore, thoroughly and heartily sympathize with the gratitude of one man towards another, merely because this other has been the cause of his own good fortune, unless he has been the cause of it from motives which we entirely go along with. In other words, motives matter. We don't just say, oh, that's good because it worked. It's good because the person had good motives. So motives matter. One of the things he talks about a lot is justice. So here's, I found another source, a philosopher named James Otteson, his book, which half is about this book and half is about the wealth of nations. The half about this book really helped me in my prep. And he calls them the 3 Ps. Here's what he says. Murder, therefore, is the most atrocious of all crimes which affect individuals only, in the sight both of mankind and of the person who has committed it. So murder's bad. That's the life in person. I bolded the P for person. Breach of property, therefore, theft and robbery, which take from us what we are possessed of, are greater crimes than breach of contract, which only disappoints us of what we expected. P for property or P for possessions. The most sacred laws of justice, therefore, those whose violation seems to call loudest for vengeance and punishment, are the laws which guard the life and person of our neighbor. The next are those which guard his property and possessions. Last of all come those which guard what are called his personal rights, or what is due to him contractually from the promises of others. So that's his idea of justice. And there's this other line that's a couple of pages before that, where he says, we may often fulfill all the rules of justice by sitting still and doing nothing. Because if you're sitting still and doing nothing, you're not murdering, you're not stealing, and you're not breaching a contract. Well, you might, right? I said I'd show up and I didn't, but typically you're not breaching a contract. So that's the basics of justice. He also says, though, that we need each other and love matters. So he says, it is thus that man, who can subsist only in society, was fitted by nature to that situation for which he is made. All the members of human society stand in need of each other's assistance and are likely exposed to mutual injuries. Where the necessary assistance is reciprocally afforded from love, from gratitude, from friendship and esteem, the society flourishes and is happy. All the different members of it are bound together by the agreeable bands of love and affection, and are, as it were, drawn to one common center of mutual good offices. Okay, now, here is my favorite quote from Adam Smith. And by the way, it turns out it's Russ Roberts' favorite quote. Man desires not only to be loved, but to be lovely. We want not only to be loved, but to be lovely, which means worthy of love. And that drives us. And by the way, I said, often he's talking about what people are, so he's pointing out a fact about people. But sometimes he's talking about how people should be. And I think this is one of those times. We should want to be lovely. And that's why Russ Roberts titled this thing, How Adam Smith Can Change Your Life. You know, you can become more lovely. And then he says more about that. The man who applauds us, either for actions which we did not perform, or for motives which had no sort of influence upon our conduct, applauds not us, but another person. I don't know if you've ever been on an airplane, I've been in a lot in the last few years, where they say, we've got military people on board, please applaud. And a lot of us do. I never do. I taught military officers for 33 years. I came to love so many of them. But I love them based on who they are, who they were, what I knew about them. I don't do a blank check for people who I don't know what they did. And I had a student, a military student, kind of affirmed my view of those things. He says, I hate it when people say thank you for your service. They don't know what I did. How can they thank me for my service? So, and that brings me to being hated versus being hateful. Again, not the military thing does, but loved and lovely. He says, neither is it in this case too so much the thought of being hated and despised that we are afraid of as that of being hateful and despicable. I think that's such a huge distinction. Are you afraid of being hated, an understandable fear, or are you afraid of being hateful? In other words, you should be hated if you're hateful. And I think a lot of us have trouble, but that distinction is a very powerful one. As I said, I became an Ayn Rand fan when I was 17, and that led me quickly to libertarianism. I was in college, and I was advocating that people be free, and I was arguing with a lot of leftists on campus. And many of them, by the way, in those days were civil. Isn't that nice? This one wasn't. He called me a brown shirt. And I knew what that meant. My parents had taught me about the Holocaust. My uncle had been imprisoned, and aunt had been imprisoned by the Germans during the war. I mean, I knew what that meant. And at first it was like a gut punch. I mean, after all, I was 17. And then as I thought about it, and I told my friend Clancy, who was my mentor, I write about him in one of my books, I laughed. It's like, that's absurd. I'm advocating freedom, and I'm being called a devotee of one of the biggest enemies of freedom and life in history. Well, I'm not hateful, I'm just hated, right? And that's a big difference, and that's a big difference to carry with you. And when I first met my wife, we were in our early 30s, and someone had called me a name, and she said, you weren't that upset by that. And I said, no, someone called me a brown shirt when I was 17, and she said, that must have been devastating. I said, only for about half an hour, and then I moved on. And so, it's really important. And by the way, I had a little note on there. This is me, not Adam Smith, but I think it's also exactly what he would say. The difference between being accepted and being acceptable. So you'll hear people say, well, back then, it wasn't acceptable for black people to eat with white people. No, it was completely acceptable. It just wasn't accepted. And that's a pretty big difference. I was at this conference a couple years ago, and there was this younger economist who was doing work with an older economist who happened to have won the Nobel Prize. And both the older, and they were working together, both the older economist and I were in the audience, and he and I were both kind of urging him to go this next route that was unpopular. And he said, oh no, that's not acceptable. And I said, no, it is, it's just not accepted. And his Nobel Prize called him. Nodded his head. Okay. Now there's also a famous one. Who here has heard about Smith talking about the earthquake in China? Okay. Now here's one where he's literally talking about how people are, not necessarily about how they should be, but he has a lot of tolerance for how they are. Let us suppose that the great empire of China, with all its myriads of inhabitants, was suddenly swallowed up by an earthquake. And let us consider how a man of humanity in Europe, who had no sort of connection with that part of the world, would be affected upon receiving intelligence of this dreadful calamity. He would, I imagine, first of all express very strongly his sorrow for the misfortune of that unhappy people. He would make many melancholy reflections upon the precariousness of human life and the vanity of all the labors of man, which could thus be annihilated in a moment. He would too, perhaps, if he was a man of speculation, enter into many reasonings concerning the effects which this disaster might produce upon the commerce of Europe and the trade and business of the world in general. And when all this fine philosophy was over, when all these humane sentiments had been once fairly expressed, he would pursue his business or his pleasure, take his repose or his diversion, with the same ease and tranquility as if no such accident had happened. And that's just very human. This next one gets into that. He talks about whining and melancholy moralists. He says, these whiny and melancholy moralists who are perpetually reproaching us with our happiness while so many of our brethren are in misery. So that's kind of, he's saying, they're kind of whining and moralizing, and we're just trying to live our lives. And it reminded me, I've been in various Facebook discussions over the years, and there was one about some victory someone had, maybe someone had got a paper published. A lot of my friends on Facebook do that. I can't remember what it was, but another friend of mine said, and this was just after October 7th, after the Hamas attack, and another friend said, do you think it's appropriate for us to be sharing our pleasure at these things so soon after that? It was like the next week. Or is this just me? And I replied, and I knew her, and I thought she would take it right, and she did. I said, I think it's just you, and maybe others, but I think it's appropriate. We go on with our lives. And then this one woman came on who I know through Facebook. I don't know her, but she's got terminal cancer, and she says it's absolutely appropriate to share all her pleasure. I've got a few months left to live. I want to take part in other people's pleasure. I want to have my own pleasure. So basically, this attitude we have about these bad things that happen in the world, they are horrible, but Smith is saying people still go on with their lives. And with his word whining and melancholy, I think he's even saying they should go on with their lives. So here's one of those things where he does verge over from here's how people are to here's how people quite reasonably should be. I think that's what he's saying. Also, he has this thought, which I think, again, I agree with him. I call it focus your sympathy. Page 142, he says, the man who should feel no more for the death or distress of his own father or son than for those of any other man's father or son would appear to be neither a good son nor a good father. In other words, your son or father dies. Someone else's son or father dies. You don't even know them that well. He's saying, which is it appropriate to feel more concern about? Your own, your son, your father. What kind of father would you be if you didn't care more about your son's death than about someone else's son's death? So again, it's like part of this whole earthquake in China thing, I think, to some extent. Again, there are times when he shows himself, I think, as not just analyzing, but advocating. I call this Smith as Dear Abby. And he deals with two things, adversity and prosperity. So first of all, adversity. Are you in adversity? Do not mourn in the darkness of solitude. Do not regulate your sorrow according to the indulgent sympathy of your intimate friends. Return as soon as possible to the daylight of the world and of society. Live with strangers, with those who know nothing or care nothing about your misfortune. Do not even shun the company of enemies, but give yourself the pleasure of mortifying their malignant joy by making them feel how little you are affected by your calamity and how much you are above it. That's the adversity part. The prosperity part. Are you in prosperity? Do not confine the enjoyment of your good fortune to your own house, to the company of your own friends, perhaps of your flatterers, of those who build upon your fortune the hopes of mending their own. Frequent those who are independent of you, who can value only for your character and conduct and not for your fortune. Neither seek nor shun, neither intrude yourself into nor run away from society of those who are once your superiors and who may be hurt at finding you their equal and perhaps even their superior. So he's basically saying, get out there. You're feeling bad? Get out there and experience the world. You're feeling good? Get out there and experience in the world. Another issue he addresses, which is kind of like the celebrity thing we talked about earlier, but this is specifically about politicians, that the innocent, though they may have some connection or dependency upon the guilty, which perhaps they themselves cannot help, should not upon that account suffer or be punished for the guilty, is one of the plainest and most obvious rules of justice. In the most unjust war, however, it is commonly the sovereign or the rulers only who are guilty. The subjects are almost always perfectly innocent. Whenever it suits the conveniency of a public enemy, however, the goods of the peaceable citizens are seized both at land and at sea. Their lands are laid waste, their houses are burnt, and they themselves, if they presume to make any resistance, are murdered or led into captivity. And all of this in the most perfect conformity to what are called the laws of nations. I think just there, he isn't just observing something that is true. Again, I distinguish between observing and reporting and advocating. I think here his passion really comes through. He thinks that's awful. He thinks the people who are responsible for things are the ones who should be held responsible. I saw a cartoon a friend on Facebook put, and I hope I got this right. It shows these people in Israel, and they got a little sign saying, Netanyahu isn't us. And then they show some people in Gaza, and they got a little sign saying, Hamas isn't us. So innocent people on both sides are being hammered, and they're not the ones doing it. Also, one of the interesting things he talks about is love of country. He says, the love of our own country seems not to be derived from the love of mankind. In other words, we don't love, by the way, I did move here from Canada, and I don't think I get much trouble with Justin. I do love the United States more than Canada. I love Canada, but I love the United States more. But it doesn't come from my love of mankind. What's it come from? He gets to it. We do not love our country merely as part of the great society of mankind. We love it for its own sake and independently of any such consideration. And then he says, the love of our country seems in ordinary cases to involve in it two different principles. First, a certain respect and reverence for that Constitution. And boy, does that ring true with me, come from a country that had a so-so Constitution to one that has what I think of as a very good Constitution, or form of government which is actually established. And secondly, an earnest desire to render the condition of our fellow citizens as safe, respectable, and happy as we can. Again, we connect more with people we know who are close to us than people in, say, some other country, and that's just kind of natural. Now, this is not exactly Adam Smith, this next thing, but when I was working on this talk, that just spurred in me this memory of one of my favorite quotes from an American. You've heard of the idea, my country right or wrong. Well, there was a senator who actually was born and grew up in Germany who came over and became a senator from Missouri named Carl Schurz. And Senator Matthew Carpenter said on the Senate floor, my country right or wrong. And Schurz answered, my country right or wrong, if right to be kept right, and if wrong to be set right. And that's I love that word. By the way, when I saw Carl Schurz, I just thought he was like with the SDS or something in the late 60s. It sounds like that, right? And no, he was an actual senator. By the way, if you look up Carl Schurz, don't expect you're going to find that you're going to like everything about him, as I learned when I looked at his history. But that one I like. Now another one, he talks about a fretful temper which feels with too much sensibility every little cross accident renders a man miserable in himself and offensive to other people. So he's saying, you know, some people have this thing, one little thing upsets them. And when I'm reading this, that got me to this next one. And it's a 4-minute thing. I can't stop it. If I go on, we're going to lose it. So be patient. You're not going to have to be patient. It's a kick. It's this comedian named Louis C.K. And you might have heard other things about him, and some of those things are true, but that doesn't mean he isn't a great comedian.
There's a lot of trust back then, yeah.
Those were simpler times, I think. I just feel like we may be going back to that, by the way. But in a way, good, because when I read things like the foundations of capitalism are shattering, I'm like, maybe we need that. Maybe we need some time where we're walking around with a donkey with pots clanging on the sides.
You think that would just bring us back to reality?
Yeah, because everything is amazing right now, and nobody's happy. Like, in my lifetime, the changes in the world have been incredible. When I was a kid, we had a rotary phone. We had a phone that you had to stand next to, and you had to dial it.
Yes.
You realize how primitive? You're making sparks in a phone, and you actually would hate people with zeros in their numbers because it was more like, oh, this guy's got 2 zeros. Screw that guy. Why do I want to? Yeah. And then if they called and you weren't home, the phone would just ring lonely by itself. And then if you wanted money, you had to go in the bank for when it was open for like 3 hours. You had to stay in line, write yourself a check like an idiot. And then when you ran out of money, you just go, well, I can't do any more things now.
Right.
I can't do any more things.
That's it, yeah.
That was it. And even if you had a credit card, the guy would go, ugh, and he'd bring out this whole shunk, and he'd write, you'd have to call the president to see if you have any money. And
it's all true, kids. You had to call the president, yeah. It was ridiculous.
Yes.
Do you feel that we now, in the 21st century, we take technology for granted?
Well, yeah, because now we live in an amazing, amazing world, and it's wasted on the crappiest generation of just spoiled idiots that don't care, because this is what people are like now. They got their phone, and they're like, it won't. Give it a second. It's going to space. Can you give it a second to get back from space? Is the speed of light too slow for you? Yeah. I was on an airplane, and there was internet, high-speed internet on the airplane. That's the newest thing that I know exists. And I'm sitting on the plane, and they go, open up your laptop, you can go on the internet. And it's fast, and I'm watching YouTube clips. I'm in an airplane. And then it breaks down, and they apologize, the internet's not working. The guy next to me goes, this is bull. Like, how quickly the world owes him something he knew existed only 10 seconds ago.
Right.
And on planes, flying is the worst one, because people come back from flights and they tell you their story. And it's like a horror story. They act like their flight was like a cattle car in the 40s in Germany. That's how bad they make it sound.
Right.
They're like, it was the worst day of my life. First of all, we didn't board for 20 minutes.
Right.
And then we get on the plane, and they made us sit there on the runway for 40 minutes. We had to sit there. Oh, really? What happened next? Did you fly through the air incredibly like a bird? Did you partake in the miracle of human flight, you non-contributing zero, that you got to fly? You're flying! It's amazing. Everybody on every plane should just constantly be going, oh my God! Wow!
Yes!
You're flying. You're sitting in a chair in the sky.
Yes. Yeah. That's right. Now, Louis...
But it doesn't... it doesn't go back a lot. And it's
Shares
not
a
really.
little.
You know, here's the thing. People they say there's delays on flights.
Yeah.
Delays, really? New York to California in 5 hours. That used to take 30 years to do that. And a bunch of you would die on the way there and have a baby. You'd be a whole different group of people by the time you got there. Now you watch a movie and you take a dump and you're home.
Yeah. Well, nicer way to say it than that, but yeah.
No.
So a couple things just that reminded me of. I've loved this video for over 10 years, and I was flying Monterey to LAX and LAX somewhere east. And we had that kind of thing where we're out, you know, we left 10 minutes late, and we're gonna have to wait for our flight to take off for 20 or 25 minutes. And this young woman I've been talking to said, oh, you know, that's horrible. She didn't use all the bad language, but that's horrible. So I managed, because I guess I broke the rules, I pulled this up on YouTube and played it for her. And it affected, I mean, she got it, like how, and so people talk about how horrible flying is nowadays. I still don't. To me, it's still this amazing miracle, you know, that you can be somewhere and then 5 hours later you're 2,500 miles away from that somewhere. It's just amazing. And I blog on something called Economist, and I don't do it every year, but sometimes on Thanksgiving, I will talk about all these things that I'm thankful for. And so one of mine is, you know, I grew up in a small town in Midwestern Canada, Manitoba, and my father didn't believe in TV, so we didn't have a TV. So I would go to a friend's place to watch Disneyland, and there were 4 things: Adventureland, Tomorrowland, Frontierland, and Fantasyland. And I, being a boy, I always wanted Adventureland or Frontierland. But to me, it was all Fantasyland, because it was just, there was no connection between that and my life. If you had told me then that I would live in coastal California, have a beautiful wife, a beautiful daughter, 1 car each, and we would go to Disneyland 6 times in our lifetime, which is true, I never would have believed you. I mean, that's just how far my family came, but it's how far tens of millions of people have come. And those things, that always helps me with that. Oh, you poor dear, you were held up for an hour. Yeah, okay. No one ate me, it wasn't the Donner Pass, you know. Now another one he talks about, and I gave it this title, but I think it was justified given the way he wrote about it. Oh, remember, Adam Smith is lecturing, and I think these are probably his lecture notes. So he's talking about some of the major philosophers of the day, people like this guy Hutcheson, who I'd heard about, don't know much about, a guy named Mandeville. And I left the Mandeville thing at the end of the thing because I think he got Mandeville wrong, so I'm probably not going to go there. But the Stoics, he talks about the Stoics. And so you might be surprised by this, but what I got from his discussion of the Stoics, you'll see in the title I gave it. Stoicism sucks. And here's where I think says that. Nature is not prescribed to us this sublime contemplation as the great business and occupation of our lives. She only points it out to us as the consolation of our misfortunes. The Stoical philosophy prescribes it as the great business and occupation of our lives. That philosophy teaches us to interest ourselves earnestly and anxiously in no events external to the good order of our own minds, to the propriety of our own choosing and rejecting, except in those which concern a department where we neither have nor ought to have any sort of management or direction. The department of the great superintendent of the universe, superintendent with capital S, meaning presumably God. By the perfect apathy which it prescribes to us, by endeavoring not merely to moderate, but to eradicate all our private, partial, and selfish affections, by suffering us to feel for whatever can befall ourselves, our friends, our country, not even the sympathetic and reduced passions of the impartial spectator, it endeavors to render us altogether indifferent and unconcerned in the success or miscarriage of everything which nature has prescribed to us as the proper business and occupation of our lives. In other words, Stoics are saying don't care about anything. And I'm not sure if he's right, by the way. Like, I've never studied Stoicism. But that's what he got out of it. And so here he is setting himself against a major school of thought at the time. Now, this one I title Walk the Walk. But the best, the surest, the easiest, and the readiest way of obtaining the advantageous and of avoiding the unfavorable judgments of others is undoubtedly to render ourselves the proper objects of the former and not of the latter. In other words, you want to be thought of favorably? Do the things that you should do. You want to be thought of badly? Don't do those things, or do the opposite. And so this next one relates to that because he quotes Socrates. I say walk the walk in the words of Socrates. Do you desire, said Socrates, the reputation of a good musician? The only sure way of obtaining it is to become a good musician. Right? There's no, and as soon as I read that, I thought of Lady Catherine de Bourgh in Pride and Prejudice, where she says, if I had ever learned to play the piano, I should have been a great proficient. And, you know, it kind of reminds me of the head of North Korea, where he says he got like all holes in one once when he was golfing, you know. No, there's kind of, okay. Now, we often hear the term virtue signaling has become this big negative term. And often I'm on board with that, but I'm not always. And that's what this quote led me to, and you'll see the title I gave it. I say virtue signaling is fine if you're virtuous. And that's what I got from this quote. The condition of human nature were, I think he means would be, peculiarly hard if those affections which by the very nature of our being ought frequently to influence our conduct could upon no occasion appear virtuous or deserve esteem and commendation from anybody. In other words, if we're doing good things, why shouldn't we get approval? And remember, the man within the breast, the impartial spectator. Would the impartial spectator approve? So why not be proud of your virtue? It can go overboard, of course, but why not be proud of your virtue? In ethics, in philosophy, the philosophy of ethics, there's one main issue, really, that's never been resolved, and I think can't be. It's called sometimes, how do you get an ought from an is? How do you derive a morality just from reason, just from facts? And philosophers have, well, Ayn Rand claims she did, and when I was 17, 18, I thought she had. By the time I was 19 and I read it carefully, I thought she hadn't. But I don't think you can get an ought from any is, and I think virtually almost all philosophers agree with me. And by the way, when I was thinking about going to graduate school, I was torn slightly between economics and philosophy. But it was the ethics that motivated me, that I wanted to study, and by the time I was 19, I figured out, no, I don't want to hit my head against the wall for the next 50 years. And economics is very interesting, and by the way, more lucrative. So here's the quote where he basically says what I'm saying: you can't get an ought from this. But though reason is undoubtedly the source of the general rules of morality and of all the moral judgments which we form by means of them, it is altogether absurd and unintelligible to suppose that the first perceptions of right and wrong can be derived from reason, even in those particular cases upon the experience of which general rules are formed. So the word first there is an important word. What he's saying, I think, is once you have certain ethical beliefs, you can then use facts and reason to argue from those to what you should do. So let's say I think theft is wrong, well then I think taking this from you is wrong, just as I think taking $1 million is wrong. But what we can't do is get to that first. In other words, we can't get to those just from reason. Which, by the way, bothers me less as a human than it used to. Because what I observe when I look around the world, I mean, for example, every major religion I know of has the idea that murder is wrong. So somehow people came to it, even if they didn't literally reason their way to it. Well, what the heck, I will give you his thing on Mandeville, but then when I read more about Mandeville, I just thought, that's, well, okay. He says, wherever our reserve with regard to pleasure falls short of the most ascetic abstinence, he, Mandeville, treats it as gross luxury and sensuality. Everything according to him is luxury which exceeds what is absolutely necessary for the support of human nature, so that there is vice even in the use of a clean shirt or of a convenient habitation. So even having a clean shirt is wrong according to Mandeville. But when I read about Mandeville, and granted I did a lot of the research on it yesterday, because this was one of the last little pieces, I didn't see that. He was saying something kind of like what Adam Smith is saying, except in Wealth of Nations, except more extreme. Adam Smith would not say that self-interest is vice. Mandeville might, but Mandeville says when people act on it, they do good things for other people, which sounds an awful lot like Adam Smith. So maybe he was trashing a competitor, I don't know. But anyway, those are his thoughts on that, whether or not they're correct. Okay, that's what I have prepared.